I'm hoping that you're starting to get a bit of a framework for Isaiah. That's really the main intention, so that you could sort of almost visually create a chart in your mind that puts everything in its relevant section and unfolds in your mind without having to read all the 66 books, 66 chapters of Isaiah. So hopefully a chart similar to this. You may break it up slightly differently to how I've suggested, but I think this here is following the natural breakage in the record that Isaiah has deliberately put there. Each section is very distinct from the previous section, and unless you sort of know where he's going and why he's doing it, you could quite easily get lost, as I used to years ago when I thought, I need to get a handle on this. It was intimidating, it was so big, but this has helped me. So that's the aim. So if there's anything that you could add or suggest, I'm all ears to take on board your suggestions. So this is sort of where we got to last class. And we've noted that the first half has as its theme kingship. Okay, the word king, I won't ask you how many times it occurs. I think we've said it a few times now, but 23 times the word king is used in the first half, but only 4 times in the second half. A very different theme in the second half. That's the word servant. King's servants. Okay? So if you were to think about humanity and the relationship that exists between people, you will only find that there are 2 categories. That there are the leaders and there are the followers, whether that be masters and servants, whether that be kings and subjects, whether that be parents and children, whatever relationship you're talking about, there is always someone out in the front and someone that comes behind. And so what God's doing in the book of Isaiah is he's showing those 2 parts, those 2 elements that at any stage in your life, you will be one or the other. All of us are followers, okay? We're all servants, but there are times when you will be required to be a leader and you'll be required to stand up and be out the front, whether that's in your workplace, in your family, in your ecclesia, whatever the situation might be, there are times when you'll be asked to be a leader. And who's the example to follow when it comes to good leadership? Because good leadership is what's required to deliver people from challenges that they face. And of course, they were facing an immediate challenge from the Assyrian, the dominating power of the time, of the then known world. Who was going to deliver them from the Assyrians? And of course, there were all these factions within Jerusalem around the king giving suggestions for this, that, and the other. Prior to Assyria becoming the dominant power, Uzziah and Ahaz have come and gone. Assyria was beginning to show its head when Ahaz was on the throne. And of course, the threat to Ahaz was just as real as the threat to Hezekiah, who followed after Ahaz. So what type of leaders were they? Well, Isaiah is going to give you a taste of that leadership. And Uzziah and Ahaz were both bad leaders. But Hezekiah, the expectation of Hezekiah coming on the scene as a good leader was so high. Isaiah is so thrilled with the idea of a good leader coming that the way he writes is he's building up to this. And chapter 32, our reading for tonight, really is going to zero in on Hezekiah and his cabinet, Hezekiah and those around him who are going to show strong leadership at a time when it was most needed. And of course, chapter 32 is a prophecy also of the Lord Jesus Christ. And we find ourselves in Isaiah 32 in prophecy. So hopefully we'll get to that and be able to unravel that a little bit later on. But then we came to the book of burdens, and we saw how the idea of sovereignty, of kingship, continues on in this section where God says, I'm not only the king of Israel, I'm not only the king of Judah, I'm not only the king that supports the son of David in Jerusalem, I am king of all the nations. So irrespective of where you go to seek help, whether it be the Babylonians or the Moabites, I control and am sovereign of them too. God is sovereign of the nations. And of course, the American election is going to demonstrate that he is sovereign. Whatever people might think and the anxieties they might have about this, we know it's God that rules in the kingdom of men, setting up over them whomsoever he will. But then, having gone through the burdens, and we'll remind ourselves of that structure in a moment, okay, because it's neatly packaged. Isaiah's neatly putting it together so that you can sort of see it in its simplicity. We come to, and we didn't quite really get onto this last class, chapter 24 to 27. Now, you'll notice on there that I've called it the major apocalypse in Isaiah. And you'll also notice that a little bit further along in the chart, there's a section that's tagged on the end of the book of Woes, which we've called the little apocalypse. They are really saying the same thing in both sections, but just use different imagery. And of course, when we use the word apocalypse, the word apocalypse is an unveiling, isn't it? An unveiling. And of course, the book of Revelation we call the apocalypse. It is the unveiling, and imagery is used to describe this that's quite different to imagery you would see in everyday life. And we know that there are, 7-headed dragons in the book of Revelation, and they're wearing 10 crowns, and there's a lamb fighting with a beast, etc., etc. And language found there is taken from, say, the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, which also has apocalyptic language. But it doesn't always have to be this very vivid imagery that's sort of out of the norm. It can also be imagery that you are acquainted with in everyday life. And that's what we find in this section. The imagery is stuff that you can understand, but it's very graphic. Hugely graphic, revealing what's going to happen because God is king, okay? And that's what's going to be seen in this section. But because it's under the heading of the book of burdens, the language that you've seen in the book of burdens about the world and city empires, etc., is all the language that's going to come up in the major apocalypse. So I've called it, this is my title for it, A Tale of Two Cities. And we'll have a look at them in a minute, but A Tale of Two Cities, God's city versus the world's city, okay? And they're ideas that you've already seen last class that came out of the book of burdens, okay? Because let's just remind ourselves how it sort of unfolded. Remember this structure here of all, and 10 nations are used. There are more nations than 10, but 10 is a number defining all. So he's taken 10 as a representative number of everything this world stands for. This is man's world, and God is sovereign over man's world. But the two bookends to that section, we went through in quite a bit of detail, and we saw that they really are the empires that epitomize man's ultimate glory. And I didn't have this on last week, and I forgot to mention it, but these two empires were really the eastern and western extreme of the then known world. And Babylon over there in the east was the epitome of man's glory, and Tyre over there in the west was the epitome of man's glory. And all of these words here we identified, and you can see Babylon is called the world, for example. Do you remember that? I will punish the world for their evil, but it wasn't the world, it was Babylon. But they affected so much of the world. That word comes up in Isaiah 24 to 27. He's going to talk about two cities, the world city and God's city. So he's going to use this same language of Babylon and Tyre in this section to say, this is what I mean when I'm talking about the world city. I'm talking about cities like Babylon and Tyre. And the word city came out quite a bit. The golden city, Babylon was called. The crowning city, Tyre was called. So this is man's city. And in Isaiah 24 to 27, you never get told where the city actually is. You just get a description of this city. And there are many suggestions, and commentators will give all sorts of suggestions saying that it is Babylon. I'm going to suggest that I think it's actually any city that's ever been that puts itself as a contrast to God. And of course, Babylon and Tyre, as the bookends to the book of burdens, really do epitomize the heights of man's glory in society in the last, 6,000 years. And that's been replicated, hasn't it? Time and again throughout history. And I've called it the epitome of man's glory. That's what's going to be destroyed in the tale of two cities. Cities like this. And so this structure showed how, and I've swapped it now to east being on the right and west being on the left. So thanks for that correction last week. These four surrounding nations showed a representative of all surrounding nations of Israel. You can't go to any of them for help because God is sovereign of the surrounding nations too. And then there's those four sarcastic prophecies where Judah failed to look to the future to see things from God's viewpoint. And they were stuck in a valley and they had no vision whatsoever because they could only see as far as the hillside on the other side of the valley. And for about, I'm not sure how long it was, 8 years of my life, I lived in a valley over in Wales, and it was a very narrow valley, the Cunnan Valley, and I don't know how wide it was, 20, no, not even 20, maybe 10 miles wide. Okay, so you literally could not see over the mountain. You were stuck in the valley. And okay, there's a nice river flowing through it, and the sun coming across the top of the mountains was a beautiful sight, but you never saw the sun until, much later in the day because everybody else saw it, but you had a mountain in the way. Well, that's what they were stuck down in this valley, which they thought was a valley of vision, but God was saying no. And all of these here are sarcastic. And it was seen in that trade route that went across the empire. Now, I've put this map back up again to show you that Babylon and Tyre, you can see Tyre on the left and Babylon on the right, that is the then known world. That's the eastern, western sort of epitome of man's glory in Babylon and Tyre. And so these four sarcastic prophecies were talking about the trade route across the desert, which down the track, when Merodach-Baladan and Nabonidus were fleeing from either the Assyrians or the Medo-Persians, they came down into this area seeking refuge, wanting to hide away in the forests of Arabia. And there were nowhere to really hide at all. You want to turn to Babylon for help in the future? You think they're going to be able to support you? They're going to be running from the enemy just as much as anyone else down the track. So God says, I know the future. I know 100 years from now. I know 200 years from now. And you calling out to Babylon for help. And of course, that's the whole second half of Isaiah. Hezekiah invited Merodach-Baladan, the king of Babylon, to come down and be his friend. And God says, you just don't know the future, Hezekiah. As a result of this, your people are going to go into captivity into Babylon for 70 years. Babylon will not be a helper in time of need. Trust in me. I am the sovereign. So that language found in chapter 13 to 23 is the same language in this apocalypse of chapter 24 to 27. And it's the major apocalypse because there's 4 chapters, whereas chapter 34 and 35, there's only 2 chapters. But they actually are telling the same story. One's using cities, one's using landscapes. Okay? 2 contrasting landscapes in chapter 34 and 35, 2 contrasting cities in chapter 24 to 27. So a tale of 2 cities, and that'll come up again, a tale of 2 landscapes. And you probably already know, the desert blooming is the language of chapter 35. But how did it get to be a desert in the first place? Well, that's chapter 34. So 2 contrasting landscapes. So chapter 24 to 27 is giving us descriptive language of what God plans to do in the future, at the end of time. That's what an apocalypse does in Scripture. It's a revelation of God's secrets, and he's revealed them to us because he doesn't hold secrets from his friends. That's what Jesus said in John 15, didn't he? If you're the friend, okay, a servant doesn't know what his master doeth. But I don't call you servants, I call you friends. And I'm going to reveal to you what's going to happen. And of course he did in the book of Revelation. Jesus Christ revealed to his friends everything that's going to happen in apocalyptic language. Well, God's already done this in the Old Testament here in Isaiah. So just a brief rundown of chapter 24 to 27. A neat little section on its own, but linked in to chapter 13 to 23. Each chapter has 3 divisions, so it's quite easy, okay? And the 2 outsides are always the same, and the inside is a contrast. So you're talking about 2 contrasting cities, a tale of 2 cities. Well, the whole structure of this section is showing this contrast. So, for example, verse 1 to 13 of chapter 24 gives very graphic language of God's destruction on the earth. I've called it the world city. It uses the word earth and land and the word city, or all of those words are used. Okay, you can see, for example, verse 1, behold, Yahweh maketh the earth empty. Verse 4, the earth mourneth and fadeth away, the world languisheth. And then down in verse 10, the city of confusion is broken down. So whether it's land, earth, world, or city, it's using those 4 identifiers to describe where this destruction takes place. So I've just clumped them together and called it the world city, which is the whole earth, which is opposing God, is going to be destroyed. And that goes from verse 1 to 13, and then it gets picked up again in verse 17 to 23. The destruction of the earth. And the way the earth is destroyed in verse 1 to 13, the imagery there is slightly different to the imagery used in verse 17 to 23. But it's still destructive language. And then couched in the middle of that is this contrast that out there in the earth, there's this remnant who know what God's doing and are crying out for God to come and save them. Okay? And they don't look at the destruction, the pending destruction in despair. They rejoice in song. And so that's going from verse 14 to 16. You'll see in verse 14, They shall lift up their voice. They shall sing for the majesty of Yahweh. You think, how can anyone be singing aloud for joy in the midst of so much destruction? There's clearly a change in the ones who are manifesting or singing this song, because they are manifesting the thinking and the character of God, and they're aligned with God, and they know what God's doing, and they're rejoicing that this earth is going to be destroyed. And so you get this contrasting picture in the middle of this chapter of destruction. So chapter 25 is a description of God's victory in this destruction, okay? And same again, you get two similar themes that are either end of the chapter, and then something that's different in the middle. In this case, it's all relating to the joy and the happiness at God's victory over the earth, over the world city. So you get a personal song. And the reason we know it's a personal song is because the pronoun is I, all through verse 1 down to verse 5. This may be Isaiah singing this song as a personal song. I don't know. Or this might be a personal song on the lips of individuals who just randomly sing this song in prospect that God is coming and will wrought a great victory. But in the first instance, it may even be that it's Isaiah himself. O Yahweh, thou art my God. I will exalt thee. I will praise thy name. But then in verse 6 to verse 8, you get a description of the feast that the saints will participate in when God is victorious. He will provide this glorious feast. And this feast is a feast, in verse 6, of wines on the lees, of fat things full of marrows, of wines on the lees well refined. He's going to destroy in this mountain the face covering cast over all people and the veil that is spread over all nations, and he will swallow up death in victory. So this victory is more than just the destruction of the earth, of God's enemies in physical manifestation, like in people or in empires, but the greatest enemy of all God will be victorious over. And the greatest enemy of all is sin. It's death. And so this victory is going to result in no more sin, no more death. Wouldn't that mean that you'd want to share in the rejoicing of that and share in the feast of God's victory in that? And so that's the rejoicing that takes place in this feast in verse 6 to 8. And so in verse 9 to 12, now you get another song, but this time it's a collective song, because the pronoun here is we and us. Verse 9, and it shall be said in that day, lo, this is our God. We have waited for him, and he will save us, you see. So a personal song in the first half and a communal song in the second half, but both about rejoicing. Why? Because God is victorious. You can always trust him. He's king, you see. He is the sovereign over the earth. He's the king of the world. And to put your trust in him means that you reap in the benefits of his victory. Now, how did God overcome sin and death and wrought this great victory? Well, he did it through his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. And this first half of Isaiah, you've been seeing how there are 4 prophecies of this coming king, this coming leader, this coming one who would destroy sin in his role as leader. And he was a leader, wasn't he? He was a leader in his family when Joseph, we assume, passed away. He was head of the house. He was a leader of the band of disciples. He was a leader of a group of women that followed him around. Then there were 70 disciples. And it grew. And now he is the leader of a community of believers. He's our great high priest. He's a king priest, is he not? And of course, we saw Uzziah, the failed king priest. We saw Ahaz, the failed son of David. But the victory won't be because of bad kingship. The victory will be because of good leadership. A king who was faithful, a faithful king in every way. So much so that he was sinless and he overcame. And so chapter 25 talks about that victory that God will wrought through his son. And so then you get a description of this glorious city in chapter 26. And again, the two outside parts are both talking about the future, and the center is talking about the present. So this structure of contrast is just woven all the way through. This is his style, and he's telling you what he wants you to understand by the way he actually puts it together as much as the content that's within it. I think that's quite remarkable. So this city is going to be, look at verse 1, in that day shall this song be sung in the land of Judah. We have a strong city. My word, it will be strong. It's got truth for its walls, it says in verse 1. It goes on to say, salvation will God appoint for its walls and its bulwarks. Open ye the gates that the righteous nation which keepeth truth may enter in. This will be a haven for truth and righteousness. And this will protect any saint that wants to go into this city. So future protection will be found in God's city. All other cities will be brought down. Have a look at verse 5. For he bringeth down them that dwell on high. The lofty city, he layeth it low. So the lofty, proud city is gone. God's city is elevated. And the second half, verse 19 through to 27 verse 1, 27 verse 1 should really belong to chapter 26, is again talking about future deliverance from God's judgments. And of course, a lovely little section that you might have a personal affection for, like I do, is found in verse 20, isn't it? Come, my people, enter thou into thy chambers, and shut thy doors about thee. Hide thyself, as it were, for a little moment, until the indignation be overpast. So we'll be shielded from all the trouble that this world will face, brothers and sisters, as God unleashes his judgments on the world. And with the American election, and who knows quite what will happen, whether America just suddenly just pulls back and sort of stops being the world's policeman and pulls back off the scene. And we know that's the door that will open up for Putin to start doing his moves, etc., and Ezekiel 38 to start unfolding. And the world is going to find itself having hearts that are going to fail with fear, as Luke 21 says. And the nations are going to be trapped with perplexity, aren't they? Their hearts failing for fear, not knowing what's going to come on the earth. We don't have that fear. We know that we're going to be protected. We're going to have future deliverance from God's judgments, as this verse. In fact, those who have passed away in our community, we know in verse 19 that they will live again. Their deliverance is assured. They will be raised to life again. Thy dead men shall live, together with my dead body shall they arise. Awake and sing, ye that dwell in the dust. But that doesn't take away that we still live in the presence. And sometimes it feels like we're just waiting and waiting and waiting. And how much longer is God going to hold out on us? And so verse 7 to verse 18 is a description of the patience we should show as we wait for God to bring his protection, to bring his deliverance. And then in chapter 27, there's this section just dealing with Israel, who are the apple of his eye. They are the firstborn of the nations, aren't they? And they are the ones whose hope it is that we hope to be associated with, the hope of Israel. Well, where do they fit into God's purpose? Well, without picking up too much of chapter 27 at all, again, you've got the first and the last part talking about their future protection and redemption. And in the middle, you've got this section about their present judgments. And we know that they would not escape judgments throughout all their history. And they've gone through some pretty nasty stuff, haven't they? I will not remove them, says God in Jeremiah 31 and 30. I will not make a full end of them. But, Deuteronomy 28, 29, 30, your life will hang in the balance, and there will be times when you just don't know what will happen to God's people. Their life will be hanging in the balance with stress and challenges and anxiety, whether it be the pogroms of Russia or the Holocaust of Nazi Germany, or living next to Gaza today, or living in the northern parts of Israel, just on the border with Lebanon. When's the next rocket? When's the next shell going to come? Well, this is what God says about them. In chapter 27, he picks up the language of the vineyard again. And you may remember we did allude very briefly to the song of the vineyard in chapter 5. The song of the vineyard in chapter 5. That was a pretty bleak picture, that song, wasn't it? What more could I do? I've tried, I've dug and I've fertilized and I've watered, and it's just bringing sour grapes all the time. The only thing I could do is rip it out, pluck it up. What more could I do? Well, this is a completely different picture, this vineyard here. This is a song of the vineyard where God says he will do everything to protect this vineyard. He will go to the greatest lengths to protect this vineyard. Look at verse 2. In that day, sing ye unto her a vineyard of red wine. I, Yahweh, do keep it. I will water it every moment. Not a day will go by that I'm not looking after you, Israel. Lest any hurt it, I will keep it night and day. And he shows a very different picture to what you might have thought back in chapter 5. I don't have a chart to show the contrast there, but you might like to go and build your own chart about the song of the vineyard in chapter 5 and the apocalyptic song of the vineyard, talking about the ultimate end times. What would God do to Israel? Well, he always will look after Israel. So hopefully that's just shown you a bit of a taste of the tale of two cities. And I keep calling it Tale of Two Cities. Why? Well, just look at the chart behind me, and you will see that all through that section, there are two worlds that are mentioned, there are two lands, there are two cities, there are two songs. And they're not in sort of any real order, they're all over the place, but they're clearly identifiable. One group are here and the other group are here. And the difference between them is that this is all selfish and attributed to man and man's emotions and feelings and goals and ambitions. And this is all the values based upon godliness and uprightness and truth. And so I've just suggested by when it uses the word world, what's it actually referring to? Not just location, okay? It's a set of values, okay? We use it today. Ooh, that's very worldly, we would say, of somebody doing something that they're trying to bring into the ecclesia, a worldly attribute. And we would say that that's worldly. because we're referring to a culture, a set of values. Well, I haven't put them all on there. I've just selected one for each example, but the list of these is quite enormous, and you can build your own chart out of this. But the world city is described as being haughty and proud. 24 verse 4 talks about the haughty city, the haughty people, I should say. Verse 4, the earth mourneth and fadeth away. The world languisheth and fadeth away. The haughty people of the earth do languish. Whereas in God's city, we saw in chapter 26 that only truth seekers will enter that city. He that keepeth truth, 26 verse 2 says, can enter in. If you're not keeping truth, all right, you cannot enter in. And of course, it's got to be God's truth, not your version of the truth. You know, my truth, as you might hear today. And everyone's got their own truth. Well, no, it's got to be God's truth. There are two lands. So a little colouring exercise to do. The word earth, land, world occurs extensively all through this section, particularly in chapter 24. So let me just give you a taste, and you can go on and finish it off yourselves. You'll see in verse 1, behold, Yahweh maketh the earth empty. Verse 3, the land shall be utterly emptied. Verse 4, the earth mourneth. The world languisheth, the earth do languish. So 3 times there. World, earth, land. Verse 5, the earth is defiled. Verse 6, therefore hath the curse devoured the earth, and they that dwell therein are desolate, therefore the inhabitants of the earth are burnt. All the way through, you can see, can't you? That's in contrast to God's location. Now, what's God's location called? Well, once we're told the actual name of the location in verse 23 of chapter 24. Then the moon shall be confounded and the sun ashamed when Yahweh of hosts shall reign in Mount Zion. So that's the location of God's city. And from thereafter, you'll see that it's called this mountain. Have a look at chapter 25, verse 6. And in this mountain shall Yahweh of hosts make unto all people a feast. Verse 7, he shall destroy in this mountain. Verse 10, for in this mountain, all the way through. You'll see 2 more. 26, verse 21, for behold, Yahweh cometh out of his place. Well, you know what that is now, because it's told you. It's Mount Zion. It's his mountain. And then the final one is the very last verse of chapter 27, closing out this section, reading right at the end, and the outcasts in the land of Egypt and shall worship Yahweh in the holy mount at Jerusalem. There's no question. There's the world, the land, the earth over here, and then there's Mount Zion, this mountain, God's place, God's mount in Jerusalem. There are 2 cities. I sort of chose the word, this is the identity, okay, or the outcomes. And the one city, you can go through and find all of these. It talks about it being broken down, it being destroyed, it being desolate. But the one that's probably quite crucial is back in chapter 24, verse 10, the city of confusion, okay, the city of chaos. The world city is a madhouse, utter confusion. You know, men are women and women are men and things like that. Just utter confusion and chaos and breakdown in society. And chapter 25, verse 2, for thou hast made of a city, the world city, a heap, of a defense city, a ruin. The world city thought it was well defended, but it just collapsed. It became a ruin when put up against God's judgments. Whereas God's city is full of strength and truth. We have a strong city of salvation. And then finally, there are 2 songs. There's one where you're drinking, but not because you're happy. All right? You're drinking because you're depressed. That's in chapter 24 and verse 8. Or verse 9. They shall not drink wine with a song. Strong drink shall be bitter to them that drink it. They're drinking it because they want to drown their sorrows, not because they're happy. So that's a song of despair. Whereas the other one is a song of joy. And of course, that's basically most of chapter 25. The personal song and the communal song are all joyous songs. So quite a contrast and graphic imagery to go along with it. This is what God's got in store for this world, brothers and sisters. And we have to choose, who do we identify with? Because who we identify with will be the outcome for us of that place we identify with. I thought it was interesting, and I'm not going to turn all these up. I thought it was interesting that when Jesus gave a similar prophecy about the end times in Luke 21, Matthew 24 and Mark 13 as well, but Luke 21 just changes it slightly. Luke's got a different purpose for recording the Olivet prophecy, and he adds detail in which Matthew and Mark don't record. And it's in Luke 21 that it seems that Jesus quotes from this section of Isaiah quite extensively. And you will see all of those there are all links back to Isaiah 24 to 27, mainly Isaiah 24, the destruction coming on the earth. And Jesus uses the same language, okay? And you know, you'll see that verse 19, the earth shall be clean dissolved. It's quite interesting that the Septuagint uses the word perplexed. The earth will become perplexed. And of course, Jesus picks up that word in Luke 21, and upon the earth, distress of nations with perplexity, utterly no way out. So a tale of two cities. And then we come to a section which just seems to make a completely new change again. We move away where the focus is about the nations over there, and we come back to the headquarters in the leadership council in Jerusalem here. We come back to the king's court. We come back to the leaders of the nation of Israel and Judah who have to make these decisions about who are they going to get to help them in their defense against the Assyrians. Do we go to Babylon? Do we go to the Egyptians? Do we go to Moab? And we get a bit of a taste of what's going on in Jerusalem. So not the nations over there now. Now it comes back in to Israel and Judah itself. And there are 6 woes. Can you remember where woes came up before? Anyone? No, in Isaiah already? You had to have been to all 4 classes so far, but not chapter 1, no. So chapter 5 had the song of the vineyard, and then it had 6 woes and 4 therefores, right? 6 woes and 4 therefores. So what you're seeing is that language Isaiah has already used does come up again on different occasions. And so he's reinforcing ideas. And the 6 woes are clearly judgment woes, and here they are judgment woes, but they are put in a different context here. These are woes to the leadership in the nation. I'll come back to that. So here they are, all right? So you coloured all your burdens in, chapter 13 to 23. Well, now we've got to colour in the word woe. It occurs 6 times, and there they are on the screen. Woe to the crown of pride in chapter 28, verse 1. Woe to Ariel, chapter 29, verse 1. Woe unto them that seek deep to hide their counsel in 29, verse 15. Woe to the rebellious children in 30, verse 1. Woe to them that go down to Egypt in 31, verse 1. And then the final one is in chapter 33, verse 1, woe to thee that spoilest, woe to the spoiler. So 6 woes. What on earth is this about? Well, I've divided it like this. There are 2 chapters for each heading. This is a section about the leadership in the nation's court, the king's court in Jerusalem and Samaria, particularly Jerusalem. So Hezekiah's court. So Hezekiah has to make decisions, and he's got men around him that he uses to help him, guide him, make good decisions. He's got ambassadors, and he sends these ambassadors and he sends them off to, say, Philistia or down to Egypt or to Babylon to see how things are going elsewhere. And Hezekiah did make some alliances that went pear-shaped. And the Assyrians came down and shattered that alliance. And Hezekiah had to learn to choose to let God be the decision maker in the nation's decisions. You leave God out of the picture and you end in disaster, in ruin, in chaos. So Hezekiah learned this, and that's why he became the type of the Lord Jesus Christ. So what we have is, how do you lead? How do you show leadership in your family, in your ecclesia, in your workplace, wherever? Here it's in Jerusalem, but take these points for your own personal lives. And of course, chapter 28 and chapter 29 highlights the problem of bad leadership. And the bad leadership is going to be seen in the north and in the south. Foolish leaders and false counsel. Have I skipped? I have. Sorry about that. Bad leadership. There were some who were saying, I've got the answer. Egypt is a superpower. Let's go to Egypt and get them to support us. With their help, we'll be able to hold off the Assyrians. So there's 2 chapters about how not to trust in Egypt. That's a false solution. That's bad leadership. You do that, you're ending up in destruction, just like all the other nations that had already fallen before Assyria. And then you get these 2 wonderful chapters, just absolutely mind-blowingly wonderful in their description of God's solution, both for Hezekiah's time, but of course, ultimately for the future. The true solution, trust in Yahweh's provision of the king. So it's interesting, isn't it? It's all in this king section, which is the first half of Isaiah, the leadership section. So, chapter 28 says, woe to the crown of pride, to the drunkards of Ephraim. Ephraim. What do you know about Ephraim? Well, Ephraim is the 10 tribes in the north that have their capital city in Samaria. And the king of the time up there, either Pekah or Hoshea or whoever it might be, who were reigning at the same time as Hezekiah, were making their decisions up there in the north. Now, I've just summarized what this chapter is about without going through sort of anything more lengthy. Notice that Isaiah calls these leaders drunkards, okay? And they are literally drunk. They are so full of it. They are so confident. They have parties all the time that they are spilling over in literal drunkenness. How can you lead when you're drunk? Like, you're not allowed to drive a car when you're drunk because your judgment skills are zilch. So what sort of judgment skills have you got leading a nation when you're partying all the time? And of course, Hosea, the prophecy of Hosea, talks about them being physically sick, vomiting up on the party table. That's how drunk they were. So these are the drunkards in the north. And they don't like Isaiah speaking to them because they think that he's treating them like little children. Oh, here comes Isaiah, a little here, a little there, okay? Precept upon precept. He keeps on preaching all the time to us in verse 10 and verse 11. And God says, look, if you don't like how Isaiah talks to you, and he talks to you in the Hebrew language, you're going to have a major problem with the Assyrians when they come, because they're going to talk to you in an unknown language. They're going to talk to you in a stammering lips, and you're not going to have a clue what they're saying. So don't go telling Isaiah off. Now, these leaders made a covenant with Egypt to stop the Assyrians. Okay, but Egypt was going to pierce their hand. In fact, go to verse 20. Egypt was like a duvet cover that's too short to cover your body. Right? You're in bed and you're a bit cold, and you pull up the duvet cover and your legs are sticking out and it's cold. Verse 20. For the bed is shorter than a man can stretch himself on it, and the covering narrower than he can wrap himself in. That's Egypt for you. Can't cover you, can't protect you. So that's the north. Woeful leadership. See, the woe to the north. But down in the south, it wasn't much better to start with, because before Hezekiah came along, of course, there was Ahaz. And then when Hezekiah did come on the scene as co-regent, there were still these others that said, let's go to these other nations for help. So chapter 29, verse 1 says, woe to Ariel. Now, Ariel. Well, where's Ariel? Well, it's called the city where David dwelt. And down in verse 8, it's called Zion, Mount Zion. So clearly this is Jerusalem. And down in the south, the leadership is woeful. And this time it says that they are also drunk in verse 9. Stay yourselves and wonder, cry ye out and cry. They are drunken. But this time it's not literally drunk, not with wine. They stagger, but not with strong drink. For Yahweh hath poured out upon you the spirit of deep sleep, and hath closed your eyes, that the prophets and your rulers, the seers, hath he covered. So these are drunk with a lack of spirituality. This is an indulgence in hype that Assyria can be stopped by the Egyptians. So this is drunk with policy, wrong policies. And they're asleep at the wheel, this leadership. They don't know what way to turn. Now, we probably don't have time to talk about the two types of leaders. Maybe we'll keep it to next time or not, I'm not sure. But you can see in verse 11 down to verse 14 that there are two types of leaders. Those who had the skill but they didn't have the will, and those who had the will but they didn't have the skill. And if you're getting the slides, you can see I've sort of expanded that on the next slide a bit more. Now, the results of this type of leadership were disastrous, and God's saying, I'm going to have to wipe out this leadership. I'm going to have to start again. I'm going to have to introduce new leadership. And of course, God does. He brings Hezekiah on the scene, and he brings in a leadership that is going to be the true solution. So, chapter 30 and 31 show the problem, show the example of trusting in Egypt, the wrong solution. And of course, 2 chapters deal with that. And out of the burdens, Egypt was one of them. And remember, there was an example of where Egypt couldn't be trusted because they failed in the matter with Ashdod. So why would you go down there to get help in this situation when they've already failed big time once? And they handed over, I've forgotten his name now, King Yamani, I think it was. They handed him over from Egypt to the Assyrians. And they said, oh, you have him. We can't deal with the Assyrians. So God says he's going to take this leadership back from these disastrous pro-Egyptian counselors, and he's going to give it to others. Well, who does he give the leadership to? Well, chapter 32 and chapter 33 are two of the most wonderful chapters. Chapter 32, particularly verse 1 to 8, brothers and sisters, just says glorious prospect of the true leadership that's coming. And This true leadership, brothers and sisters, is a prophecy, of course, of the Lord Jesus Christ as well. But clearly, it was Hezekiah in the first instance. But the beauty about this, and we're just going to leave it with this slide here, which you've seen before. The beauty about chapter 32 and 33, brothers and sisters, is that this includes us. Because we've already seen two prophecies of the coming king back in chapter 9 and chapter 11. The individual king, the Lord Jesus Christ. But he won't rule on his own. He's going to have a cabinet. He's going to have co-regents ruling with him, the kings and priests of the future. And they're mentioned here, particularly in verse 1 to 8, and also in chapter 33. And we are part of this leadership of the future, these kings of the future, those who will have escaped sin and death because they made good judgments and good decisions during their life of probation. Let me just tell you how we know that this is about the saints, brothers and sisters. Verse 1 of chapter 32 says, "Behold, a king shall reign in righteousness." Where have you heard those words before? What chapter of the Bible would you go to talk about a king that reigns in righteousness? Psalm 72, right? But what does Psalm 72 go on to say? And shall rule in judgment in Psalm 72, right? Talking about a single individual. But here, Isaiah says a king shall rule in judgment, but princes, plural, shall rule with him, reign in righteousness, I should say, and princes shall rule in judgment. Who are these princes? Well, verse 2 to verse 8 tells you who these princes are. Because verse 2 says, "And a man shall be as an hiding place." Really, that's a mistranslation. It should be, "Each one shall be as an hiding place." It follows on from verse 1. "A king shall reign in righteousness, and princes shall rule in judgment. Each prince shall be." And you get a description of each prince and what they will be like and their decision-making skills. And you get in verse 5 and verse 6, 5, 6 and 7, the bad leadership types will never be part of the princes of the future. People like the vile person, people like the churl, the fool, they won't be there. That type of leadership will not be accepted as part of Christ's government. These princes, in verse 8, shall be liberal. Now that's a bad word, liberal. It actually, I'm skipping over a couple there, it actually means to be generous, to be noble, all right? If you've thought, oh, liberal means to be, like anything goes, that's not what this word means. This word means to be noble, to be upright. Not many noble are called, said Paul in 1 Corinthians. Not many mighty. The noble are called because they are generous in their assistance with others. That's what you want for a good leader. And our final verse for tonight says that these ideas are picked up in chapter 33 and verse 15. "He that walketh righteously and speaketh uprightly, he that deviseth the gain of oppressions and shaketh his hands from holding of bribes and stoppeth his ears from hearing of blood and shutteth his eyes from seeing evil." Verse 17, "Thine eyes shall see the king in his beauty." If you want to be part of that government, if you want to see the king in his beauty, you will be like that of verse 15. That's the government of the future, brothers and sisters. So I think we'll leave it there. We didn't quite get on to the sort of bit that gets attached to the end of this, the little apocalypse, which takes all the language that we saw in chapter 28 to 33. It takes that language and it puts it into a tale of two landscapes, where we get a description of God's garden versus man's desert. And so we'll park it there, and I think we've got a gap between now our next class, brothers and sisters. So hold on to those thoughts, and God willing, we'll come back next class and just finish off 34 and 35, and then leap into the second half, which is all going to be about service. We'll leave leadership behind, and we focus on service. And God willing, brothers and sisters, we'll be able to see what Isaiah has in regards to salvation for us in the Book of Comfort.